Welcome to another lesson in epidemiology. So, this would be your chapter 11 for epidemiology. Specifically, we're going to be covering study designs that are common in epidemiology. Now, a quick disclaimer before we start. This are or the study designs that are going to be discussed in this chapter or in this lesson is not all the study designs that we can utilize. So there are other different designs, but these are the most common that I've found for use in epidemiological studies. So in this presentation, we're going to be covering four different topics. We're going to be covering descriptive study designs, where we describe situations, problems, and other health related phenomena. Then we have our observational research designs, which is just basically observation without any form of outside intervention. And then you have your experimental research design, which is basically observation, but this time we have interventions. And then, of course, number four, we have screening and surveillance. So let's start with our first topic, descriptive study designs. Now, descriptive study designs are typically before or done before hypotheses are developed. So basically, these are to lay a foundation of what we want to study further in the future. So there are different types of descriptive study designs. The first would be your case studies or your case series. So this is typically used with unusual presentations of a disease or an unknown series of diseases. So, for instance, there is an example in this slide, rare case of COVID-19 presenting as acute abdomen and sepsis. So this is a case report or a case study, and this is just to illustrate how COVID-19, which is typically uh, upper respiratory tract infection or presents as a upper respiratory tract infection. You're going to have runny nose. You're going to have a blocked sinus, and then you're going to have a cough. So these are the typical presentations of COVID-19. But in this specific case, detailed in this study, it presented as an acute abdomen and sepsis. So there are different presentations of diseases. There are different cases where the disease may present as a separate or a different form of its presentation. And these are where case studies and case series would come into play. Next is your ecologic study. So ecologic studies focuses more on the community rather than the individual. This particular image is from Shutterstock, so credits to them. And this is going to be a study that describes the whole community as a whole, how it interacts, and the characteristics of that community. So the problem with ecologic studies is usually, sometimes, sorry, not usually or sometimes. So that would be oxymoronic kind of describing this. But ecologic studies are studies that describe the whole community. And what happens is sometimes researchers, or rather readers of the research, would associate the findings of an ecologic study to the individual level. So that is a fallacy that we want to avoid when doing ecologic studies, because again, we're describing the community, and sometimes the interactions of a community is only present when they are in that specific community. So sometimes people would, or most often than not, no, people would act differently in different communities and on their individual level. So basically, the results of ecologic studies should not be applied to the individual. Next, we have cross-sectional studies. So cross-sectional studies are very important, particularly because it describes a certain population at a specified point in time. So you have two different variables that you have to consider here. First, of course, is the population or a certain aspect or variable in the population being studied, and of course, your specific time frame. So cross-sectional studies are considered in a very short time frame as compared to other studies. And that means that sometimes your cross sectional studies would be outdated, meaning that it is already obsolete. And then this is not the case all of the time. So there are lots of cross-sectional studies that are recent, and typically cross-sectional studies have to be redone time and time again to describe the population, as populations do evolve and change over longer periods of time. Okay, so basically these are the studies that we use to describe a certain population, a certain ecologic group, and of course a certain rare presentation of a certain disease. So basically, when we say descriptive studies, we're describing a certain variable or certain aspect of a population or an individual. Now, do take note that studies that involve the population is different from the studies that involve the individual. Okay, moving on to our observational study. So basically, when you say observational, we simply observe without intervention. Now, this could be either progressive, meaning we start from our initial starting point, our time zero, and then we move forward. So that is what we refer to as a prospective study. Or it could be a retrogressive study, meaning that we start at the end and then we move backwards. So basically, we investigate the medical history of the patient and the different experiences that the patient went through interviews, through surveys, and so on and so forth. Okay, so for observational studies, we have two. You have your case control, which compares individuals retrogressively. So this is exclusive for our case control study. And then you have your cohort study, which typically compare pairs referred to as cohorts progressively. So basically, case control studies, retrogressive, meaning we start at the end and we gather data through medical histories and interviews, whereas your cohort study, on the other hand, can be done progressively and retrogressively. So either way, you can start from the moment of exposure going forward, or from the moment that they heal going backwards. Okay, so again, case control studies are done retrogressively. Cohort studies can be done progressively or retrogressively, depending on the opportunities. And typically, your case control studies are shorter, whereas your cohort studies are longer. And the goal of these two is quite different in that their case control is usually done for correlations. So forgive me for the terrible handwriting. I'm using a mouse. And then your cohort study is typically done to establish causality. Okay, so for these studies, okay, so you have case control, typically a lower sample size, and cohorts require a larger sample size. So here are two studies that would give you an idea of how case control studies are used and cohort studies are used. So for case control, we have lung cancer and smoking habit. This is a case control study. So meaning that the data was gathered using their medical history and their smoking history. Whereas you have your cohort study, a prospective cohort study of type 2 diabetes and the risk of Parkinson's disease. So basically, what they did was they took cohorts with type 2 diabetes and studied the risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So again, this is progressive, meaning that they don't have Parkinson's disease yet, but they're trying to see whether type 2 diabetes can cause or is a factor in causing Parkinson's disease. Next of the study designs, we have experimental. So this is observation with intervention, just to put it plainly. So, experimental, by the way, would be the highest form of evidence we consider in a study. Now, clinical trials is just one of the many designs that we can use in experimental research, but this is considered to be the highest level of control and the study variable and interventions, or of the study variable and intervention. So, when you do clinical trials, you have to be very careful of your study selection, your population and sampling, and you have to be very sure of the variables that you need to consider. So, basically, we're trying to eliminate all confounding variables that may affect the study and therefore only measure the effect of what we're administering to our samples. Last, for this topic, you have your screening and surveillance. So, screening and surveillance sometimes can be used interchangeably, but that is incorrect. So, when we say screening, you focus on testing larger populations and excluding cases, where in surveillance, you focus more on intense testing for smaller at risk populations. So, basically, your screening tries to exclude cases while your surveillance is focused on at risk populations. So, when we say screening, you're typically testing you using a screening test, a rapid test, whereas in surveillance you use a more robust diagnostic test to make sure that the at-risk populations are not developing the disease. Okay, so it's a very short presentation. It's a very short topic as well, and just so we're clear, we do have more study designs that you can use for your research, not just this. So you have descriptive experimentals, you have experimental correlational, you have many different kinds of studies that you can explore. Now these are just the study designs that are usual for epidemiologic studies, and plus screening and surveillance. So the concept of screening and surveillance might be a bit more specialized in epidemiology, so we're not going to deeper into that. So thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something new.